Hi, my name is Blake Kammerdiener. I am one of the programmers for the South by Southwest Film Festival, and I'm here with another great Q&A alongside the Prime Video presents the South by Southwest 2020 Film Festival collection. And I am here with the incredible team from Tales from the Loop. We are super excited. We have you all here today. We have Nathaniel Halpern, the creator, writer, showrunner, and executive producer. We have Mark Romanek, director and executive producer. We have Simon Stålenhag, who is the artist and writer of Tales from the Loop, the book, and executive producer on the series. And we have Rebecca Hall, a series star from Tales from the Loop. So I want to jump right in and really start with you, Nathaniel, and ask you about the unique inspiration that you had for this series and kind of how you approached that when you were writing the stories for this.
Well, I mean, it all started with Simon's book and the artwork that's collected within there. And I essentially, like a lot of people, were really drawn to his aesthetic, which is quite unique, which is rare to find. And there's this wonderful marriage between the ordinary and the extraordinary. And on top of that, I also just sensed a great deal of emotion. They're very poignant, the images that Simon created. And so the idea of turning that into a TV series was a very exciting notion. And so it was just about trying to be faithful to that feeling and the aesthetic that Simon created. And essentially within that, how do I tell stories that feel very human and emotional, which is the response I had to his work.
Well, and for you, Simon, so when creating these images, did you imagine them coming to life like this?
No, it's not. I mean, it's kind of unattainable when you're doing it as a side project, as I did when I started doing these pictures. You don't ever think it will happen. I did this as kind of a way to tell visual stories, like a way of making films. But I could do it in like one person in my little cabin out in the woods, and I could kind of get as much kind of cool stuff in there as possible. And I had, I mean, it was not a plan that this would happen. So it's just an incredible, I don't want to say bonus because that kind of undersells it, but yeah, it's magical.
So how do you feel about the stories that evolved from the process of moving these into the on-screen medium?
Well, I think I feel very fortunate to have Nathaniel do this, because I think there's a lot of people who would do more kind of artificial drama or more artificial plot, or try to kind of heighten the tension in a way that isn't true to the book, because the book is the stories that I wanted to write. Because when I first put out the pictures, people imagine all sorts of things, like there's an alien invasion or whatever. And so I decided to write the texts, because I felt that the texts, like this world was much more mundane and ordinary, and very much like very, very personal. And it had to do with my own, me growing up here outside of Stockholm and on the countryside. And I didn't want that kind of big science fiction stuff happening. And Nathaniel had the exact same feeling about it, and it was, I think it was a very, very like a perfect match.
That's amazing. So I mean, the whole team, I feel like, was you brought together such a really, really strong team. So like across the board. So so for Mark, I wanted to ask you, you know, quite often with series, that unifying theme and look come, you know, straight from the showrunner. But here you brought together, and you can see that theme across the series, but here you also brought together this incredibly strong list of directors, starting with you in that first episode. So I was really curious about that working relationship between Nathaniel and yourself, and the other directors, and what kind of freedom was given to you to kind of bring your talent to the screen as well.
That was for me?
Yeah.
You know, the mood of those paintings is so mysterious and evocative and enigmatic. I think, you know, Nathaniel and I were trying to retain that quality, but in cinema, I'm really drawn to things that aren't explained fully, that kind of make you lean forward or make you have to try to understand what's happening. So we tried to keep that. It was, you know, very collaborative with Nathaniel and I, where for the purposes of the story, we had to solve a lot of aesthetic problems that weren't necessarily already represented in some of Simon's work to keep it consistent. One of the first things that Nathaniel and I talked about were like filmmaker references, and one of the top ones that came up was Kieslowski's Decalogue, which was a series of 10 short films, but that all is of a piece. And immediately when Nathaniel said that, I understood that we're not doing a sort of a Spielbergian world, but we're doing a more kind of working class world of intellectuals that are big brain scientists. And we just talked about every single detail and worked it out. Sometimes we would, you know, if we weren't sure what to do, we would go to Simon, and or we needed something designed. Simon was very gracious. If there was something that wasn't in a painting but we needed it for the show, Simon would design it from scratch for us. So it was sort of we had a big head start in that the aesthetic was pretty clearly established, however, in the paintings, but accomplishing that subtly as cinema and doing justice to the story at the same time without it becoming too distracting, this beautiful aesthetic that he invented. That was the balance that, you know, Nathaniel and the actors and the whole crew worked on, kind of getting the right balance.
Yeah, and so Rebecca, to you, so all of the cast is so strong. Their performances are super strong throughout the entire series. And a lot of that story is told straight through emotion and almost like a silent dialogue. So I'm super curious how much of that was on the page and how much of that was kind of given to you to discover what those emotional responses would be.
I mean, I think it was very clear to me from the script what the tone of it was. It's very, like, the writing was very evocative and made a very depicted a very clear picture of who these people were. So I didn't feel that I was in the dark particularly. I mean, it was apparent on first reading that this was the sort of thing where the narrative thrust was not going to be told in a direct fashion. It was going to be indirect. And for an actor, that's incredibly enjoyable, because you're not playing scenes where you're, you know, having to do a lot of exposition. You're playing scenes where you talk about something quite banal, but you're actually trying to portray all the emotional import in whatever that simple everyday thing is that you're saying. And I love that. I love that style of storytelling. I find it to be emotionally very powerful and subtle. That sort of subtlety is very rich. You know.
Can I ask Rebecca a question?
Yeah.
Please.
Well, I mean, in the speed of shooting, you know, you always don't get to talk about things, and sometimes it's not so good to talk about things because it's just going well and you don't want to talk to death. But there's some scenes, I don't want to give anything away, but there's some scenes in the first episode that are very bizarre dynamics between human beings that really could only happen in a science fiction universe. So I was curious, just as a director to an actor, like, how much did you get into the complicated weirdness of the situation, and how did you sometimes find like a simple way through? Because some of the science fiction time travel circumstances are quite complicated emotionally. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, and I don't think I have a very interesting answer to it. I think I really don't know. I think it's a sort of often acting is weird. I don't know how to describe it. Often it's just a situation. If the script is good and everything and the component parts make sense, then if your imagination is peaked, then you just perform according to your imagination. And if you can imagine yourself into that situation.
There were some scenes that I was just going, how is an actor going to act this? It's just so complicated. And then, of course, you kind of did it beautifully without any fuss or muss.
Yeah, probably because I didn't do anything. I think simplicity is probably the best way out of that situation.
Well, it worked. It's beautiful, spectacular.
Yeah, I mean, and not only that, but it's like you break a lot of even sci-fi norms, and you, as the actor, were able to actually like portray that. Like, for instance, with the phone calls, whenever you start to realize about the girl, you know, and it's like that, it breaks not only scientific norms, but it breaks a brain on like how you would respond to that. And you did it.
She sort of knew that it was going to come someday too, so she was a little bit terrified for years, I suppose.
I think that actually I do sort of have an answer to this. I'm being a bit flip. I think that I thought a lot about the notion of the uncanny and how I can relate to that sort of sense of, I don't know, something that you know is coming, but you don't fully understand it, and whatever that sort of awesome, that feeling of awe, I mean in the literal sense, not in the kind of modern use of the word, feeling is like how you respond to something that is so huge that you can't quite grasp it in your brain and just observe it.
Uncanny is an old word that doesn't get used a lot, but it's a good word for the show, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, very good word. So I want to go drill a little. I don't know, I have a couple of other random questions that I'm super curious about. So would you consider the Eclipse a character? Or what part do you feel the Eclipse plays in the world?
Is that for me?
For anybody who has a great answer for it.
I kind of have an answer. Like, I feel like it's some sort of energy source that's motivating most of what you're seeing. And I remember when we finally revealed the Eclipse in the pilot and we were shooting, and actually it was the last day of the shoot. We had a lot to do. We needed to move very quickly with very important scenes. But I had this sense that the camera could not be static near it. Like that it has so much energy emitting from it that literally static didn't make sense. So for me, I really did actually have it in my mind as some sort of energy source that was at the sort of underneath every scene in a way.
Can I just say it's the Eclipse was one of the, you did such a great job depicting it, because it's in the book, but it's called something else. But I didn't know how to depict it, so there's no pictures of it, because it was this mysterious object that was kind of the like everything else about the loop was kind of logical. Like I used words that and scientific words that kind of made sense, but the gravitron, as I call it, or the Eclipse in the show, it was that one piece that was almost on the kind of on the border to something supernatural, and I didn't know how to depict it. I didn't know how to do that, and I didn't want to do that, so I didn't do that. And it's such a, you did it so well. I wish that I had come up with that aesthetic for the Eclipse.
Yeah, we didn't want to deal with it either, Simon. It's really hard to figure out what it would be the perfect depiction of something that you almost kind of don't want to depict. But there's a lot of discussion about what it should be and look like and feel like.
I think it was good that you didn't ask me about that thing, because it makes it look alien, because it kind of it doesn't look like the other stuff in the show. It's just weird. So yeah, I think that worked great.
So speaking of that, kind of related, Nathaniel, I'm curious about in this world, in the version of this world that you've created, how much backstory did you dive into?
I think it was, for me, I didn't want this to be a show about mythology and puzzle solving, really. I just tried to keep it as simple as possible, and I thought there was such elegance in Simon's book of he just paints the picture of this town and how it functions, and I never asked a question past that. I was like, oh, I buy it, makes sense to me. And then I was in the world, and I wanted to do that as well with the show. So for me, depicting the Eclipse and going down to the loop which Simon never depicted, for me was an effort in that first episode to say, here it is. It's not being hidden behind a curtain. Now let's get to what's important, the people that live here and their stories. So, I could bore you with, it was built in such and such year. And then the Eclipse was put into the facility then. And I had it in my mind to have a certain sense of reality, but I never wanted the stories to hang on the facts of the mythology, because then I just felt like the characters would play second fiddle. And that's just not where my interest was.
We needed to fill in a little bit of backstory just in terms of design about when were things built.
That's true, yeah.
But only the necessary information, the minimal need to know information to build the world.
Well, and yeah, some of that backstory is actually, built into the character's story, which is another beautiful part of how this is created as a series. And then there's those several threads that kind of weave everything together in the world. I guess one of those threads is music, and that's at the forefront kind of each episode, just in the incredible score that goes across, and then also just kind of how music plays kind of a role in certain characters' lives, actually. So I'm curious about what was your process on, was that on purpose? Like, did you have that kind of in your mind at the beginning, or did that evolve as you kind of brought in, your composers and the rest of your team?
Well, it feels like there's two questions there. I mean, the composing is one thing, but the music, I think Mark and I talked early on about not wanting to make real overt pop culture references in the show and not have the audience suddenly click into, oh, that's my relation. I'm thinking about my relationship to that song, to have it a little bit, maybe you haven't heard this song before. And especially in the pilot episode, wanting to have a nod to the Swedish origin of the stories. There was a playfulness to the selection, and Mark certainly found that track, and then the later recording of it from by the same artist. So there was a lot of thought put in the music. I had Mark speak to that as well.
Well, I think all along we weren't trying to just be willfully different, but we were trying to be ourselves. And so we kept, I think, through most of the choices were based on, well, what's going on these days in television, and how can we do this maybe differently or more subtly or more elegantly? And I had an experience with Philip Glass where he actually started scoring Never Let Me Go, and it didn't end up working out, strangely enough, but we stayed friends, and he's an idol of mine. And I started listening to some Philip Glass scores while I was working on the show and looking at Simon's beautiful paintings, and something just clicked. And there was something, I like scores that you go out of the theater whistling. Like, I don't like wallpaper ambient scores that are just sort of there doing their job. Like, I like melodies, and so as a testament to Simon and Nathaniel, we sent the script and these images to Philip Glass, and he said, I'm in. And I think we liked the classicism of it. We liked the forwardness of it. And the music is I think, some of the most beautiful music has ever been done for a TV series. There's a lot of comments on the internet about, have you heard the score? Yeah, there's some show attached to it, but the score, it's really beautiful, really, really thrilling. And Paul Leonard Morgan, who works with Philip, who helps kind of take his themes and mold them, and they work together, just did an incredible job. I listen to it still all the time, just for pleasure.
Yeah, it really, really, really is strong.
It's the first time Philip Glass has done a television
really
score.
I didn't realize that. That's again so strong and so memorable, and such an amazing thread throughout the entire series. Well, I mean, we've been going for a little while. We should wrap it up, but I do have one more question. I'm super curious about the set design and how because really with that set design, there are some moments within the series that are exact pictures from Simon's book that are actually replicated on screen. And I'm super curious kind of about how y'all were able to bring all that together.
Well, it's the problem solving. As you said, there it was in Simon's work, and it's just how do you then make that a reality? And there was the pilot production designer, Phil Messina, and then in series, Michael Wiley, both very talented artists who were able to bring those objects to life. It's actually interesting. I learned on this that spherical objects are the hardest ones to construct, and
they're the easiest ones to paint.
Yes. So it was it's a real testament that it looks so elegant and simple, like those things have just been sitting there forever, and yet those two production designers did an amazing problem solving and did a lot of great artistry. Even the aging on them, I really love. I often find sometimes with set pieces, you look at it and you kind of think, I almost see the paint just drying. It doesn't feel like it's lived there. And they did this wonderful way of making the Loop facility and all the objects in the landscape feel like they've just been sitting there for years, and there's such a reality to it.
There's something about the paintings, you know, that they, even though they're set in Sweden, and I'm sure they're very accurate to Sweden, they look like where I grew up. So there's an interesting kind of amalgam of sort of America for me that maybe I'm projecting onto it, like American suburbia, and the show is set in the Midwest, and then this super strange science fiction stuff, and this a Swedish European quality. So I had the production design team send out shoppers in Russia and Prague, and they filled up containers with just weird stuff from the 60s and 70s that you'd never see in Ohio. But when you kind of mash that together with typical Ohio stuff, there's just an odd quality that it gave it its own kind of visual language. And we did that like with the music, you know, it could have been an American pop song, but we said, let's make that Swedish. And there's a little bit of a Soviet era quality that leaked in for the Loop itself and that brutalist architecture. But we tried to make it timeless. You know, we never wanted you to know exactly where you are in time in a way. But I'm sorry, Simon.
No, but it is in Sweden in the like post-war Sweden was more not. I mean, it wasn't communist, but it was much more state-run than the U.S. was in the same era, and so yeah, it definitely makes sense that you would say that, because and I try to, and that's also one of the things that I really wanted to capture when I started doing this, like because growing up in the 80s, you grew up kind of in the early 90s. You saw the kind of the ruins of this, because Sweden were becoming more like privatized and more open, but you would still play around like in the ruins of these old facilities, and so I wanted to kind of create the super version of that with the Loop. So and it's really cool how you have kind of mixed that with the US culture, because with the 80s, I think shows like Stranger Things, which is great in their own way, but they really tap into the other side of US history, which is kind of there's more representations of that, I think, and this feels really new.
Nathaniel always said we don't want to fetishize the 80s, and so we, you know, the 80s aren't really the 80s. If you look back, people are driving cars from the 60s, and there's some old people that still dress from the 50s, and somebody just, you know, nobody wears the latest 80s styles all over the place. It's just not how the world looks, you know?
Yeah.
Well, I can't thank you enough for joining us today. Y'all have been watching the Tales from the Loop Q&A. You can see more great Q&As on the South by Southwest YouTube channel and the Amazon YouTube channel. Thanks to all of you for joining me, and to Prime Video. And you can watch the pilot episode of Tales from the Loop on Prime Video Presents the South by Southwest 2020 Film Festival Collection, and the rest of the series on Prime Video. Thank y'all so much, and we look forward to seeing y'all more.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.